The chamber was never quiet. 50 species, 100 agendas, and a noise that lived in the walls like something breathing. The Galaxy Council had been meeting in this hall for 3,000 years, and in that time it had solved wars, ended famines, redrawn the borders of a dozen civilizations. It was very proud of this. It said so often. Drevakson of the Varik stood at the floor and waited. He was old. Old enough that the translator nodes in his collar had been replaced 4 times. Old enough that he remembered when the Kalos Drift was a contested zone and not a trade corridor. Old enough to have read the texts himself, in the original language, sitting in the archive room of his homeworld with dust on his hands and something cold moving through him that had never quite left. He waited until the chamber gave him the floor. Then he began. 10,000 years ago, he said, a species called the Urathi attacked a human settlement. The noise did not stop. It lowered. Slightly. It was a small colony. 43 people. The Urathi considered the matter a minor territorial action. A message. They expected the humans to understand the message and adjust their behavior accordingly. He paused. The humans understood the message. They did not adjust their behavior. They adjusted their plans. Someone near the back laughed. A low sound. Dismissive. Drevakson did not look toward it. Over the following 60 years, he continued, the Urathi were dismantled. Not in a war. There was no great battle. No declaration. No moment of confrontation that histories could point to and call the turning point. The humans simply began and did not stop. They pulled the threads that held the Urathi together. Their alliances, their supply lines, their financial agreements, their political relationships, one thread at a time, over decades, with no visible anger and no visible urgency. By the time the Urathi understood what was happening to them, there was nothing left to defend. The structure was empty. The people inside it had already made other arrangements. The chamber was quieter now. Not silent. Never silent. But the quality of the noise had changed. There were no Urathi left, Drevakson said. Not killed. Not conquered. Simply made untenable. Removed from every equation they had depended on. When the last of their governing body dissolved, the humans filed no record of victory. They sent no message. They simply stopped, because there was nothing left to stop for. High Chancellor Orez leaned forward in his seat. He was Velthani by species, and large by nature, wide-shouldered, broad-faced, with the particular expression of a creature that had held power long enough to confuse it with intelligence. Elder Drevakson, he said, the Urathi account is 10,000 years old. Verified records from that period are fragmentary at best. The Varik records are not fragmentary. The Varik were not involved in the conflict. No. Drevakson agreed. We were observers. We watched from a careful distance, and we wrote down everything we saw, and we have been carrying the warning ever since. And this is the 14th time in 3,000 years that I, or one of my predecessors, has stood in a room like this one and tried to give it to someone who did not want it. Orez's expression did not change. The matter before the council today is a routine territorial negotiation. The Velthari Syndicate has taken custody of a human research station in the Kalos Drift as a temporary measure during a corridor dispute. 12 personnel. They will be held, the concession will be extracted, they will be released. It is a standard diplomatic instrument. It is not a negotiation, Drevakson said. You have touched their people. We have applied pressure. There is no difference. Not to them. He looked around the chamber. 50 species. 100 agendas. Most of them already thinking about the next item on the schedule. You are not taking prisoners. You are lighting a fuse. The length of that fuse is the only thing you do not know. No one wrote that down. Several delegates were already speaking quietly to their aides. Orez called for the next speaker, and Drevakson walked back to his seat, and the chamber filled back up with its usual noise. And the decision about the research station had already been made before he had stood up to speak. And he had known that. And he had stood up anyway, because the texts required a warning to be given, even when the warning would not be received. He sat down. He folded his hands. He waited for what came next. In a different part of the galaxy, in a room that had no windows and no name on its door, Commander Isla Voss was reading a report. She was not a large woman. She did not take up much space. She had the kind of stillness that is not peace, but its opposite, the stillness of something that has learned to move very efficiently and has decided, for the moment, not to. Her coffee was going cold beside her and she had not touched it in 20 minutes. The report was 3 lines long. Research Station. Kalos. 7. 12 personnel. Beacon. Dark. As of 0400 standard. She read it once. Then again. Then she set it down on the desk with a small, careful motion, the way you set down something you don't want to disturb. She sat very still for a time. Her aide appeared in the doorway, young and uncertain, reading her stillness wrong. "Commander, we've received confirmation from—" "I know," she said. "Fleet Command is requesting a—" "Tell them I'll send a report." The aide waited. "Should I prepare a—" "Not yet." He left. The door closed. The room was quiet. Voss looked at the 3 lines again. She did not look angry. She did not look frightened. She looked the way a person looks when they have just been given information that changes what the next several years of their life will contain, and they are taking a moment to understand the shape of it before they begin. She picked up her coffee. It was cold. She drank it anyway. Then she pulled a blank document onto her screen and began, in small, precise letters, to write a list. It was not a long list yet. It had 12 names on it, all of them from the station. She would add to it later. But for now, 12 names, written in a neat column, each one a person who had gone to work that morning on a research station in the Kalos Drift and had not come home. She did not write anything else on the document. She saved it. She closed her screen. She went to find Admiral Callahan. 3 months passed. The Council waited for the humans to do what species do when their people are taken. It was a known sequence. There would be an ultimatum. Then, a fleet at a border. Then speeches, angry ones, made for audiences at home, full of language about sovereignty and justice and the unacceptable nature of what had been done. Then negotiations, painful and slow, ending in a face-saving arrangement for both sides. The hostages would come home. The corridor dispute would be settled. The syndicate would get what it wanted, minus a little dignity, which it could afford to lose. 3 months passed. There was no ultimatum. Councillor Feth noticed first. He was not a senior member of the council. He represented a mid-weight species called the Solon, who had the good sense to stay out of other people's wars and the bad luck to be surrounded by species who kept starting them. He was precise, cautious, and had developed over 30 years of diplomacy the particular skill of watching what was not happening and understanding why. He spread the intelligence reports across his desk and read them in order. Human diplomatic missions to 7 syndicate border systems. His first read had been relief. They were talking, not fighting. His second read was slower. He went back through the visitor logs, the meeting topics, the names of the officials who had requested access. None of it was hostile. All of it was relational. Long conversations about old trade agreements, cultural exchange programs, the kind of careful, sustained attention you give to a relationship you are planning to deepen, or to one you are learning the anatomy of. He flagged it and moved on. Human merchant vessels, quietly rerouted over the past 6 weeks. 43 ships. Standard commercial traffic, individually unremarkable. He mapped the rerouting against the syndicate's supply chain topology. The routes that had gone quiet were the ones feeding 3 sectors that fed the syndicate's logistics infrastructure. Not blocked, not threatened. Simply, elsewhere. Doing business in other directions. The haulers had found other contracts. The goods were flowing the same as before, just not through those corridors anymore. A tourniquet, he thought. Applied so slowly the patient hasn't felt it yet. He flagged that too. A series of human information requests to 14 minor species. Data on regional infrastructure, emergency evacuation routes, fuel depot locations, filed as routine safety assessments under a standard council information sharing treaty. Legal. Unremarkable on its face. He looked at the geographic distribution of the 14 species. Every single one of them sat adjacent to a syndicate safe harbor, fuel station, or resupply chain junction. Feth sat back. He went to Orez. Orez listened with the patient expression of a person who has already decided what the answer is and is waiting for the question to finish. When Feth stopped speaking, Orez said, "They're frightened. They're buying time while their internal politics settle. The concession will come. Chancellor, they haven't made contact. No back channel. No informal. They will. The rerouting alone represents a significant. Commercial decisions follow political ones. When the political situation resolves, the trade flows will normalize." Orez folded his hands. "Feth, they are a mid-tier species with 12 people in a comfortable holding facility. They are not going to destabilize the most significant trade coalition in this sector over a research station." Feth left. He did not feel reassured. He went instead to find Drevakson. The old Varric was in his quarters, reading. He looked up when Feth entered, and his expression did not carry surprise. It carried the particular weight of a person who has been waiting for a specific visitor and is not glad to have been right about when they would arrive. Feth sat down without being invited. He laid out what he had found. Drevakson listened without interrupting. When Feth finished, the old man was quiet for a moment. He looked at the wall. Then he said, "You are watching the right things. That is the first good sign. Is it enough? No." He turned back to Feth. "What you are describing is the first movement, the assessment phase. They are not building a response. They already know what the response is. They are building the infrastructure to execute it over a period that will be much longer than the syndicate expects, and they will do it without ever giving the syndicate a clear moment to respond to. How long? Long enough that by the time the syndicate understands it is under attack, the attack will already be most of the way finished." Feth looked at him. "You've seen this before. I've read about it. There is a difference." He paused. The Urathi thought they understood what they had provoked. They thought it would look like a war. It did not look like a war. It looked like nothing, for a very long time. And then it looked like everything collapsing at once, and by then there was nothing to stop. "We have to do something." "Yes." "What?" Drevakson was quiet for a moment. "You could try talking to them." In a windowless room on a human military station, Callahan was explaining the plan to a small group of officers, using very few words. He was old. He had the unhurried quality of a man who had made irreversible decisions before and understood that urgency is a feeling, not a strategy. He stood in front of a map with his hands behind his back, and he did not raise his voice once during the briefing. "We are not going to fight them," he said. "Fighting requires an enemy that knows it's in a fight. We are not going to give them that. We are going to remove every advantage they have, one at a time, quietly, and we are going to do it in the order that causes the most downstream damage, and we are going to take as long as we need to take." Someone asked about the hostages. "The hostages are the reason we are doing this," Callahan said. "They are not the timeline. The timeline is, we finish when there is nothing left to finish." He looked around the room. "Any other questions?" There were none. "Good," he said, and went back to the map. 3 weeks later, the Velthari Syndicate's primary resupply corridor, the one that fed 6 of its 9 forward fleets, quietly collapsed. Not destroyed. The contracts simply were not renewed. The haulers went elsewhere. The fuel stopped moving. The fleets did not know yet. They would. Voss was not dramatic about it. That was the thing people who had not worked with her always failed to understand. They expected fire. They expected the kind of cold fury that announces itself, that moves through a room like weather. She was not that. She sat at her desk and she worked, and the work looked like paperwork from the outside, and from the inside it was the slow and patient taking apart of a machine, one bolt at a time. She had a list. She was moving through it. The list had grown since the first night. It no longer had only 12 names on it. It had maps now, organizational charts, a web of names and relationships laid out across 6 screens, the syndicate's internal structure, every pressure point, every dependency, every relationship that could be redirected, or removed, or quietly made unavailable. She did not look at it like a soldier. She looked at it like a woman solving a very long and complicated problem, and she would not stop until the problem was solved. And there was no version of events in which she stopped before that. The shape of it was becoming visible to those who knew how to look. The syndicate had 3 species who operated as client partners, smaller civilizations who provided labor, raw materials, and regional political cover in exchange for protection and preferred trade status. They were not conquered species. They had chosen the arrangement. For most of them, it had been a good arrangement for a long time. Over 6 weeks, all 3 of them received visitors. Not human military officials. Not diplomats with ultimatums. The visitors were trade representatives, development consultants, the kind of quiet professionals who carry proposals in their bags instead of weapons. The offers they brought were better than what the syndicate was providing. Significantly better. They did not ask the client species to leave the syndicate. They simply placed a better option beside the existing one, clearly lit, and left it there. One species signed within a week. The second took 3 weeks, and a follow-up meeting. The third held out for a month, then looked at the syndicate's deteriorating logistics situation and made a practical decision. None of them defected to humanity. They simply stopped being part of the syndicate's eastern flank. They went elsewhere. They made better arrangements. It was commerce. It was rational. It was, from the outside, almost impossible to point to as an act of aggression. The syndicate's eastern flank was now open, not because it had been attacked, because its supports had quietly stood up and walked away. Callahan sent Voss a message. It was 4 words. Let them wonder longer. She sent back 2. Already am. He had been her commanding officer for 11 years, and their entire relationship lived in the gap between what was said and what was meant. He meant, the silence is the weapon. Keep using it. She meant, I know, I never stopped. The syndicate's leadership was struggling with the silence in ways it had not anticipated. They had expected an ultimatum by now. They had prepared responses to ultimatums. They had a legal team ready to negotiate, and a communications team ready to frame the resolution as a syndicate victory. They had planned for anger. They had not planned for nothing. The nothing was worse. When an enemy shouts at you, you know where they are. When an enemy goes quiet, you start checking every shadow. Syndicate intelligence began filing reports about human activity they couldn't classify. The diplomatic visits to border species. What was the purpose? The rerouted trade vessels, was it economic pressure or coincidence? The information requests filed 6 months ago. Why did they want data on fuel depots they had no apparent interest in? Each piece looked small alone. No one in the syndicate had yet put them all on the same table. The council's cracks were becoming harder to ignore. Orez called a special session to shore up support. He had not expected to need it. He had expected the human situation to have resolved itself by now. It had not resolved itself. It had instead produced a quiet, persistent anxiety that was spreading through the coalition species, the way cold spreads through a room when a door is left open somewhere. 3 species that had been reliable votes were now attending sessions without committing. They were polite. They were present. They simply had opinions about fewer things than they used to, and on the matters relating to the syndicate, they had no opinions at all. Orez pressed them in private. They gave him careful non-answers delivered with warm expressions. He came away from each meeting with the feeling that he was looking at a situation he did not yet have the right vocabulary to describe. Feth watched all of this, and said nothing in the session. He had sent a message to the human diplomatic channel 3 weeks prior. The response had come back that morning. Courteous. Formal. Not unfriendly. One sentence at the end that he had read 6 times. We are not negotiating at this time. He read it a 7th time. Not, we are unable. Not, we require preconditions. Not the usual language of negotiation, which always contains in it the seed of eventual resolution. We are not negotiating at this time. As if negotiation were something that might happen later, in a different context, after something else had happened first. As if the question of the hostages was not the center of the situation but a part of it, a symptom of something larger that had to be addressed first. He put the message down. He thought about what Drevok-san had said. They are not building a response. They already know what the response is. In the syndicate's holding facility, the 12 humans from the research station were alive and well treated and waiting. They did not know what was happening outside. They knew their people would come for them. They did not know what form it would take. Neither did anyone else. And then the syndicate made its mistake. It was not a military decision. It was a communications one. A committee of 4 senior syndicate officials, watching their internal situation deteriorate and their leverage appear to be producing no results, decided that the silence from humanity must mean the hostages were not valuable enough. The solution they reached: make them more visible. They broadcast the names publicly, all 12, with station credentials and personal details. They framed it as a humanitarian transparency measure. The hostages were alive, well treated, and their situation would be resolved as soon as the corridor dispute was addressed. They addressed the broadcast to the Council, to the human government, and to the broader galactic community. They thought it was leverage. They thought making the hostages more real, more named, more visible, would create political pressure on the human government to move. They were right that it created pressure. They did not understand the direction it moved in. Voss watched the broadcast in her quarters. She watched it once, all the way through. Then she sat for a moment with her hands flat on the desk. She pulled up her list. She added 4 names. Not the station commander who had carried out the original seizure. Not the soldiers who had done it. The 4 officials who had sat in a room and decided that broadcasting 12 people's names to the galaxy was a useful tool. She added them cleanly, at the bottom, beneath a single line of space that separated them from the rest. She saved the document. She went back to work. It did not happen all at once. That was the part that was hardest to explain afterward. When people tried to describe what had occurred, they kept looking for the decisive moment, the battle, the breaking point, the single event that had caused the collapse. They looked for it because that was how these things were supposed to work. There was supposed to be a before and an after, separated by something visible. There was no visible thing. There was only the accumulation. The syndicate's 3 largest financial backers withdrew within the same 2-week period. They were not human-aligned species. They were not particularly sympathetic to humanity or hostile to the syndicate. They were species that had been watching the situation for 8 months, running their own calculations, and had reached the same conclusion independently. The syndicate was no longer a safe investment. Not because it had been defeated, because the environment around it had changed in ways that made its survival unlikely. The client species had left. The logistics corridor had collapsed. The eastern flank was exposed. The Council coalition was fragmenting. Each of these things alone was manageable. Together, they formed a picture that any competent financial analyst could read. They withdrew quietly. They sent formal notices through standard channels. They expressed no hostility. They wished the syndicate well. The syndicate's credit rating, in galactic terms, collapsed in 4 days. The fleets noticed the fuel problem at about the same time. 6 of the 9 forward fleets had been operating on reserves for 11 weeks, waiting for a resupply that was never coming because the contracts had not been renewed, because the haulers had gone elsewhere 9 months ago. The fleet commanders had been filing reports up the chain. The reports had been received. Nobody higher up had known what to do with them, because nobody higher up had yet connected the fuel situation to the larger pattern. Now, with the financial news coming in alongside the logistics reports, someone finally put everything on the same table. Syndicate Admiral Meveritt looked at the table for a long time. Then she sent a private message to her counterpart in the second fleet, which contained no tactical analysis and only one sentence. "We have been in this fight for 8 months, without knowing we were in it." Orez called the council session with 3 days' notice. He needed the votes. He was going to get them, or he was going to force the matter to the floor and make everyone's position public and permanent. He had spent 20 years building coalitions, and he understood that ambiguity was a luxury species allowed themselves when the stakes were low. When the stakes were high enough, he could make abstaining too expensive. He had done it before. He was in the middle of the second private meeting of the day, working through the arguments he had prepared, when his aides sent him an urgent flag. He excused himself and read it in the corridor. 2 species had publicly announced they would not attend the session. Not absent. Publicly not attending. The distinction mattered enormously. Absence could be explained. Public non-attendance was a statement. They were telling the rest of the council something, without having to say it directly, in a language every species in that chamber understood. He stood in the corridor for a moment. Then he went back into the meeting and finished it, because there was nothing else to do, and because he was not yet willing to admit to himself what the flag meant. He did not get the votes. When the session came, he had enough to avoid a formal rebuke, but not enough to produce a resolution of support. The coalition he had spent 2 years assembling, the one that had made the Kalos drift seizure possible, the one that had laughed at Drevik-san, was gone. Not dramatically, not in a revolt. It had simply, gradually, stopped existing. The species inside it had made other calculations. He sat at his station after the session ended, and the chamber emptied, and the lights shifted to their overnight configuration, and he looked at the room, and for the first time in a long time, he was not sure what came next. Feth was the one who reached the human channel again. He sent a longer message this time. He outlined what he was seeing. He expressed, as clearly as diplomatic language would allow, that there were members of the council who understood the situation, had moved beyond the original incident, and who wanted to be part of finding a resolution that reduced further damage. The response came back in 6 hours. It was polite. It was precise. It acknowledged his message. It contained one paragraph that he read with the feeling of a man watching a door close from the wrong side. The message explained that the human government appreciated his communication, and that when the situation had reached a point where a conversation would be productive, they would reach out to initiate it. It further noted that a conversation would become productive when the conditions on the ground reflected a genuine change rather than a tactical one. "We will know the difference," the message said. "We have been watching for some time." The syndicate station commander's name was Greveth. He was not a political person. He had taken the posting because it was a stable assignment in a stable region, and he had a family, and he valued stability. He had been present when the 12 humans were loaded into the holding facility. He had been present when the broadcast decision was made, though he had not been among those who made it. He had filed no objection, which he thought about now, more than he had at the time. He had been watching the situation reports for weeks. He understood what was happening. He was not a senior enough official to have been included in the strategic discussions, but he was senior enough to read logistics reports, and he had been reading them, and he understood that the thing the syndicate had believed was leverage had instead become the hinge on which everything was turning. At 0300 station time, alone in the operations center, he made a decision. He did not call anyone for authorization. He did not file a report. He walked to the holding facility, opened the outer door himself, walked to the processing bay where the humans were held, and told them they were free to go. They looked at him. He said it again. They went. He watched their ship leave through the port window, running lights small and steady in the dark, moving away from the station, not rushing, just going. He went back to his desk. He sat down. He had not resolved anything. He knew that. The syndicate's situation was the same as it had been an hour ago. The walls were still coming in. He had not stopped that. He had only decided that his hands were not going to be the ones still holding this particular thing when they did. He thought about filing a report. He did not file a report. He turned off the light and sat in the dark for a while. Voss received the confirmation at 0611. 12 people. All alive. Medical status green across all 12. ETA to human space. 31 hours. She read the report. She read it again. She did not make a sound. She pulled up her list. She looked at the 12 names at the top. She looked at them for a moment. These 12 names that had started all of this. That had been the reason, and the beginning, and the point. She did not remove them from the list. The list was a record, not a to-do. It stayed. She looked at the 4 names at the bottom. Those were still there for a different reason. She saved the document and closed the screen, and went to tell Callahan. Callahan was already awake when she found him. He was in the small room off the operations center that he used as an office, sitting with a cup of something that was probably tea, and a screen that showed the same confirmation report she had just read. He looked up when she came in. He did not say anything. She did not say anything. They looked at each other for a moment, in the way that people who have worked together for a long time sometimes do, when a long thing has finally come to the part that was always going to happen. Then he said, 31 hours. Yes. Good. He looked back at his screen. Sit down. She sat. The syndicate is going to try to negotiate now, he said. Through the council. Probably through Feth, since Feth has been the one making contact. They're going to want a formal resolution, a framework, something that lets them say publicly that the situation was resolved through diplomacy. What are we going to give them? Time to finish collapsing. He said it without particular weight. Just the assessment. They don't need a negotiation. They need 6 more weeks. After that, there won't be anything left to negotiate with. Voss looked at her hands. The 4 names. I know about the 4 names. I'm not asking for authorization. I know that too. He set down his cup. I'm telling you I know about them. That's all. He looked at her. They'll feel it. It'll be clean, and it'll be appropriate, and they'll feel it for a long time. She nodded. Good, he said again, and picked up his cup. The Velthari syndicate ended not in a battle but in a meeting. It was a small meeting. 9 remaining members of the syndicate's governing board, in a room that smelled of recycled air, and something anxious that no ventilation system could remove. They had been presented with the financial reports, the logistics assessments, the intelligence summaries, the status of every alliance they had once held. The documents were thorough, and they were accurate, and they told a clear story. The story was, there was nothing left, not nothing militarily. They still had fleets, though those fleets were low on fuel and lower on purpose. But the syndicate had never been a military organization at its core. It had been a commercial and political one. It had run on relationships, agreements, shared interests, and the confidence of its partners. All of that was gone. The client species had left. The investors had withdrawn. The council coalition was dissolved. The corridor that had started all of this, the one they had seized the research station to protect, was now operating under terms that no longer required syndicate involvement at all. They voted to dissolve. It was not a unanimous vote. 2 members abstained. The rest carried it. They distributed their territorial claims back to the constituent species, filed the formal dissolution documents with the council registry, and left the building separately, in different directions, without speaking to each other. Orez heard about it 2 hours later. He was in his office. His aide read him the summary. He sat very still for a moment. Then he asked his aide to find Dravaxon. The old Varric came without urgency and sat without ceremony. Orez looked across the desk at him. The Chancellor looked older than he had a year ago. Not physically, just in the eyes, in the particular way of a person who has learned something they would have preferred not to know. How long did they plan it? Orez said. It was not quite a question. That is the wrong question, Dravaxon said. Then what is the right one? The right question is, when did they begin? He folded his hands. The answer is the evening Voss received the report about the station. They began that night. And they did not plan it the way you plan a campaign with an end date, with a defined objective. They began it the way you begin a task that you will finish when it is finished, for as long as that takes, because there is no version of the future in which you do not finish it. Orez was quiet. Then, is it finished? Dravaxon was quiet for a moment. He looked at the window. Outside, the council city moved the way it always moved, steady and loud and full of itself. 50 species and 100 agendas, the same as always. For the syndicate, yes, he turned back. For the 4 officials who made the decision to broadcast the hostages' names, Orez went still. Ask her, Dravaxon said. The 4 officials did not lose their positions. There was no tribunal, no formal action, no public accusation. Nothing happened to them in any way that could be pointed to, or protested, or described in a report. The world simply became smaller around them. Over 18 months, every professional relationship they held became quietly unavailable. Contracts came up for renewal and were not renewed. Appointments were offered and then, after reflection, offered to someone else. Organizations they had been part of for years restructured in ways that left no place for them. Species they had worked with for decades found that their schedules no longer aligned. It was not done in anger. It was not done with any visible coordination. Humanity simply removed itself from every equation the four of them were part of, and in doing so demonstrated, more clearly than any punishment could have, what it meant to be removed from humanity's considerations. Two of them understood what was happening and why. The other two spent a long time trying to figure out what they had done wrong. All four of them would spend the rest of their careers in rooms where the best opportunities had already been taken by someone else. Callahan wrote one final log entry and then closed the record. He wrote that 12 people had come home. He wrote that this had been the mission. He wrote that everything else had been arithmetic. He filed it and went to have a real cup of tea. Drevik-san went home, not to his quarters in the council city. Home, the home world. The archive room with dust on the shelves and the old texts that had been kept for 10,000 years, because the Varik believed that if you had witnessed something important, it was your responsibility to write it down so that future generations could read it and learn. He sat at the old table. He opened the record and found the Urathi account, which he had read so many times over so many decades that he knew it the way you know the inside of your own hand. He wrote a new account beneath it. He did not editorialize. He recorded facts. The station seizure, the names, the 8 months that followed, the shape of what had been done, and in what order, the dissolution, the 4 names, the 18 months after. He wrote it in plain language, because plain language was what survived. At the end, he wrote one line. The warning was given. He closed the record. He put it back on the shelf with the others. He sat for a while in the quiet, with dust on his hands, and the particular feeling of a person who has carried something for a very long time, and has finally set it down, not because it was resolved, but because his part in it was over. Weeks later, in the council chamber, a new species was presenting its application for membership. The chamber was full. 50 species and 100 agendas, the usual noise in the walls, the usual sense that the room had been doing this for 3,000 years, and would be doing it for 3,000 more. A junior diplomat from a small border species leaned toward her senior and spoke quietly beneath the noise. What about the humans? Do they attend these sessions? The senior glanced toward the back of the chamber without making it obvious. One human, seated near the far wall, still, watching the session the way someone watches a thing they have been watching for a long time and will continue watching after everyone else has gone home. Had been there the whole session. They always attend, the senior said. They never speak. No. He turned back to the front. They don't need to.